The gymnasium lights dimmed as 15,000 people rose to their feet. The announcer's voice echoed through the arena. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Olympic gold medalist." But 12 years ago, I was standing in my childhood bedroom, holding a rejection letter, while my parents told me I was an embarrassment to the family name. They said I was wasting my life chasing impossible dreams. They had no idea that one day, the entire nation would stand when they played my song. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Chen, and I was born into a family that measured success in very specific terms. My father, Dr. Richard Chen, was a cardiovascular surgeon at Boston General Hospital. My mother, Margaret Chen, was a federal judge. Our house in Beacon Hill wasn't just a home. It was a monument to achievement, with mahogany bookshelves lined with law journals and medical textbooks, and walls decorated with diplomas from Harvard, Yale, and Stanford. The Chen family dinner table was where futures were decided. Every Sunday at exactly 6 p.m., we'd gather around the antique dining table that had belonged to my great-grandfather, the first Chen to immigrate to America and build a successful import business. The conversation always followed the same pattern: academic performance, career prospects, and maintaining the family's reputation in Boston's professional circles. My older sister, Catherine, was the golden child. She'd graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law and was already making partner track at one of Boston's most prestigious firms. My younger brother, David, was finishing his pre-med requirements at MIT with a 3.9 GPA. Then there was me, the middle child who couldn't sit still during those Sunday dinners, whose eyes wandered to the window instead of focusing on the conversation about quarterly earnings and case law precedents. I was 17 when the final conversation happened. It was October 2011, and I had just received my third rejection letter from Princeton, Harvard, and Yale. The letters were polite but firm. Despite my decent grades, I wasn't competitive enough for their programs. My parents had spent months preparing me for these interviews, hiring private tutors and consultants who promised to craft the perfect application. "Jessica," my father said, setting down his coffee cup with the precise control of a surgeon, "we need to discuss your future realistically." I remember sitting at that table, feeling the weight of their expectations pressing down on me like a physical force. The chandelier above cast shadows across my mother's face as she opened a manila folder filled with backup college applications. State schools, they called them, with the kind of disdain usually reserved for discussing communicable diseases. "You're not unintelligent," my mother said, her judge's voice measured and clinical, "but you lack focus. You lack the discipline that success requires." She was talking about my after-school activities. While Catherine had been president of the debate team, and David volunteered at the hospital, I spent my afternoons at the local recreation center, teaching gymnastics to elementary school kids. It wasn't prestigious, it didn't look good on college applications, but it was the only place I felt truly alive. "Gymnastics," my father said, pronouncing the word like it was a medical diagnosis, "is not a career path, it's a hobby. And hobbies don't pay for medical school or law school." The thing is, I had never wanted medical school or law school. I had wanted to compete, I had wanted to fly. Ever since I was 8 years old and watched the Olympics on our living room television, I had dreamed of wearing that red, white, and blue leotard, of standing on that podium while the flag rose and the national anthem played. But those dreams felt foolish when you're sitting across from two people who had built their entire lives on practical achievements and measurable success. How do you explain to a surgeon and a judge that you want to spend your life on a 4-inch balance beam, that you want to twist and flip through the air in pursuit of a perfect 10? "The Patterson family sent their daughter to Stanford," my mother continued, referencing our neighbors who lived in the equally impressive Victorian house next door. "She's studying biochemistry, pre-med track. That's the kind of trajectory we should be discussing." I had known the Patterson family my entire life. Their daughter, Amanda, was a year older than me and had indeed gotten into Stanford. She was brilliant, focused, and everything my parents wanted me to be. But I also knew that Amanda had never once smiled during our neighborhood gatherings, that she looked exhausted every time I saw her, and that she'd told me privately that she felt like she was living someone else's life. The rec center where I taught gymnastics was nothing like the world my parents inhabited. It was a converted warehouse on the outskirts of downtown Boston, with fluorescent lighting and equipment that had seen better decades. The kids I taught came from all over the city, some from families like mine, others from single-parent households, where a $20 gymnastics class was a significant expense. But in that gym, surrounded by the smell of chalk and the sound of bare feet on mats, I felt like I could breathe. I had a natural ability that my coaches noticed immediately. My body seemed to understand the physics of rotation and momentum in ways that couldn't be taught. I could execute skills that other girls my age had been working on for years. Coach Martinez, a former collegiate gymnast who ran the program, had been telling me for months that I had potential beyond recreational gymnastics. Jessica, she'd say after watching me nail a dismount that should have been impossible for someone with my limited formal training, you could compete at the elite level. You have something special. But elite gymnastics required sacrifices that my family couldn't understand. It meant training 6 hours a day, 7 days a week. It meant traveling to competitions across the country. It meant choosing a path that had no guaranteed financial return, no clear career trajectory, no way to explain to other parents at dinner parties what exactly your daughter was doing with her life. The conversation that October night came to a head when I finally found the courage to speak up. What if I don't want to go to college right away? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed was deafening. My father's expression shifted from disappointment to something approaching anger. My mother's judicial composure cracked just slightly, revealing the control that she maintained over every aspect of our family's public image. "What are you suggesting?" my mother asked, her voice carrying the same tone she probably used when questioning unreliable witnesses. I took a deep breath, knowing that the words I was about to speak would change everything. I want to try gymnastics, seriously. Coach Martinez thinks I could make the national team if I trained full-time. The reaction was immediate and brutal. My father stood up from the table, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Absolutely not. We are not going to finance some fantasy while your peers are building real careers." "It's not a fantasy," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I'm good at this. Really good. And I'm only 17. I have time to—" "Time to what?" my mother interrupted. "Time to waste the education we've provided? Time to embarrass this family with some athletic pursuit that will be over before you're 25? That word embarrass hit me like a physical blow. In my family, embarrassment was the worst possible outcome. It was worse than failure, because failure could be hidden, rationalized, or overcome. Embarrassment was public. It reflected on the family name that my great-grandfather had worked so hard to establish, and that my parents had spent their careers building. "You don't understand," I said, tears starting to form in my eyes. "This isn't just about me. When I'm in that gym, when I'm competing, I feel like I'm representing something bigger than myself. I feel like—" "You feel like you're avoiding responsibility," my father cut me off. "Like you're choosing the easy path instead of the one that requires real work." The accusation stung because it was so fundamentally wrong. Gymnastics wasn't easy. It was brutal, demanding, and unforgiving. It required a level of physical and mental discipline that I had never encountered in any academic setting. But try explaining that to two people who had built their identities around intellectual achievement and professional recognition. The argument continued for another hour, voices raised in a way that was unusual for our typically controlled household. My sister Catherine, who had been listening from the living room, eventually came in to mediate with her lawyer's instinct for finding compromise. "Maybe there's a middle ground," she suggested. "Jessica could apply to schools with strong gymnastics programs, get her degree while still competing at the collegiate level." It was a reasonable suggestion, but it missed the point entirely. I didn't want to compete at the collegiate level. I wanted to compete at the Olympic level. I wanted to represent the United States in international competition. I wanted to push the boundaries of what was possible in the sport, not just participate in it as an extracurricular activity. But how do you explain Olympic dreams to people who see them as delusions? How do you justify pursuing something that most people never achieve, especially when you come from a family where failure is not an option? The conversation ended with my parents' ultimatum. I would apply to college, I would choose a practical major, and I would treat gymnastics as the hobby it had always been. If I wanted to continue training, I could do so in my spare time, but it would never take priority over my education and career preparation. That night, I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of our Beacon Hill neighborhood settling into quiet. Through my window, I could see the lights of downtown Boston, the city where my parents had built their successful careers and where they expected me to do the same. But all I could think about was the feeling of flying through the air, of that moment when gravity releases its hold and you're suspended in perfect balance between earth and sky. I thought about the national anthem, about what it would feel like to stand on that podium while the flag rose and the music played, knowing that you had pushed yourself beyond every limit to get there. I had no idea that 12 years later, I would be standing in that exact position, listening to that exact song, while my parents watched from the stands with expressions I had never seen before. But that night, as a 17-year-old girl in Boston, all I knew was that I had to choose between the life my family wanted for me and the life I wanted for myself. The choice I made would cost me everything I had ever known, but it would also give me everything I had ever dreamed of. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The rejection letter from Harvard arrived on a Tuesday morning in November. I remember because it was the same day I had to make the biggest decision of my life. My parents were at work, my father performing surgery, my mother presiding over a high-profile corporate fraud case, and I was alone in our kitchen, staring at the thin envelope that contained my future. We regret to inform you that we cannot offer you admission to Harvard University's class of 2016. I didn't need to read the rest. I folded the letter carefully and placed it next to the identical rejections from Yale and Princeton that had arrived the week before. 3 strikes. In my family, that meant game over. But something had changed in me since that October dinner conversation. Maybe it was the way Coach Martinez had looked at me during practice the day before. Or maybe it was the video I'd watched online of the 2008 Olympics, where Nastya Liukin stuck her beam routine with such precision that it looked like she was defying the laws of physics. Whatever it was, I felt a clarity I'd never experienced before. I picked up my phone and called Coach Martinez. "I want to do it," I said without preamble when she answered. "Jessica, do what?" "Elite training, full commitment. I want to try out for the national team." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Coach Martinez had been coaching for 15 years, and she'd seen plenty of talented kids whose dreams were bigger than their dedication. But she'd also seen something in me that I was only beginning to understand myself. "Are you sure?" she asked. "This isn't something you can do halfway. Elite gymnastics is a different world entirely." I looked around our pristine kitchen, with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, at the family photos showing 3 generations of Chen family achievements. Then I thought about the feeling I got when I nailed a perfect vault, when everything in my body worked in harmony to create something beautiful and impossible. "I'm sure," I said. What I didn't tell Coach Martinez was that I had already started making plans. Over the past month, I had researched elite gymnastics training centers across the country. I had looked into the costs, the time commitments, the success rates. I had even reached out to a few coaches who trained Olympic hopefuls, sending them videos of my routines. The responses had been encouraging. Mike Chen, no relation, despite the shared last name, ran a prestigious training facility in Houston called Lone Star Gymnastics. He was known for developing Olympic champions, and his reputation in the gymnastics community was legendary. When I sent him footage of my floor routine, he called me personally within 2 days. "You have natural talent," he had said over the phone, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had coached multiple Olympic medalists. "But talent alone won't get you to the games. Are you prepared to dedicate the next 4 years of your life to this sport?" At the time, I hadn't been sure. Now, staring at the Harvard rejection letter, I was. The plan I had developed was both simple and terrifying. I would take a gap year, or several gap years, to pursue elite gymnastics training. I would move to Houston to train with Mike Chen. I would live in a small apartment with other gymnasts, eat according to a strict nutritional plan, and spend 8 hours a day in the gym. I would compete in national competitions, work my way up the rankings, and try to make the Olympic team for the 2016 Games in Rio. It was a plan that made sense to exactly one person, me. I spent the rest of that Tuesday researching the logistics. Houston apartment rentals for young athletes, financial aid programs for elite gymnasts, the competition schedule for the next 4 years. By the time my parents came home that evening, I had a comprehensive presentation ready. I waited until after dinner to bring it up. We were sitting in the living room, the same room where I had watched those Olympic gymnastics competitions as a child. My father was reading the New England Journal of Medicine, my mother was reviewing case files, and the television was tuned to the evening news. "I need to talk to you both about something," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. My parents looked up with the kind of attention they usually reserve for important family announcements. I could see them preparing to be supportive, probably expecting me to tell them I had decided to apply to additional safety schools, or maybe that I was considering a different major. "I've decided not to apply to any more colleges," I said. "I'm going to Houston to train for the Olympics." The silence that followed was different from the one in October. This wasn't the silence of disappointment or frustration. This was the silence of shock, of two highly intelligent people trying to process information that didn't fit into any framework they understood. My mother was the first to speak. "Jessica, I know you're disappointed about the college rejections, but this isn't the time to make rash decisions." "It's not rash," I said, pulling out the folder I had prepared. "I've been researching this for months. I've already been in contact with Mike Chen at Lone Star Gymnastics. He's willing to take me on as a student." I explained the financial aspects, the training schedule, the competition pathway. I showed them videos of gymnasts who had started elite training at 17 and made the Olympic team. I had statistics about the success rates, the injury prevention protocols, the educational programs that allowed athletes to earn their degrees while training. My father listened with the same focused attention he brought to surgical consultations. When I finished, he asked the question I had been dreading, "And what happens if you don't make the Olympic team?" "Then I'll have tried," I said. "And I'll go to college knowing that I gave everything to something I believed in." "That's not a career plan," my mother said, her judicial training kicking in. "That's a gamble with your future." What followed was the most intense conversation our family had ever had. My parents weren't cruel or dismissive. They were genuinely worried about my future. They talked about the physical demands of elite athletics, the high injury rates, the psychological pressure. They mentioned gymnasts they had read about who had suffered career-ending injuries or eating disorders. But they also talked about embarrassment, about what their colleagues would think when they asked about their daughter's college plans, about how they would explain to friends and family that their daughter was pursuing a sport instead of an education. "The Patterson family just announced that Amanda made Dean's List at Stanford," my mother said. "What am I supposed to tell Margaret Patterson when she asks about your plans?" That question revealed something I had never fully understood about my parents' objections. It wasn't just about my future, it was about their present. Their identity was tied to their children's achievements, and my choice to pursue gymnastics reflected poorly on them in their social and professional circles. "Tell her I'm following my dreams," I said. "Tell her I'm trying to represent our country in international competition." "Dreams don't pay bills," my father said. "Dreams don't provide health insurance or retirement savings." He was right, of course. Elite gymnastics was financially risky. Even Olympic medalists struggled to make a living from their sport. But sitting in that living room, surrounded by the evidence of my parents' successful careers, I realized that financial security wasn't the most important thing to me. The conversation continued past midnight. My parents presented logical arguments about the importance of education, the value of stable careers, the risks of pursuing professional athletics. I countered with stories about Olympic champions who had overcome similar obstacles, about the personal satisfaction that came from pushing physical and mental limits, about the regret I knew I would feel if I didn't try. Finally, my mother played what she thought was her trump card. "If you do this, you'll be doing it without our support, financial or otherwise." The words hung in the air like a challenge. My parents had always provided for me, had always been there when I needed them. The idea of moving across the country without their blessing, without their financial backing, was terrifying. But it was also liberating. "I understand," I said. "I have some money saved from teaching at the rec center. and I can get a part-time job in Houston. What I didn't tell them was that I had already applied for and received a partial scholarship from the USA Gymnastics Foundation. It wouldn't cover all my expenses, but it would help. I had also been in contact with a host family in Houston, former gymnasts who provided housing for young athletes training in the area. The next morning, I woke up to find my parents had already left for work. There was a note on the kitchen counter in my mother's precise handwriting. "We love you, but we cannot support this decision. Please reconsider." I folded the note and placed it in my wallet, next to the business card Margaret Chen had sent me. Then I called him and told him I was ready to commit. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Once you start this journey, there's no halfway. Elite gymnastics demands everything." I thought about my parents, probably telling their colleagues that their daughter was taking some time to figure things out. I thought about Catherine, who would likely be asked to explain my decision to extended family members. I thought about the life I was leaving behind, the predictable path of college, graduate school, and professional success. Then I thought about the balance beam, about the feeling of perfect control in the midst of impossible difficulty. I thought about the national anthem and what it would feel like to hear it played for me. "I'm sure," I said. 2 weeks later, I was on a flight to Houston with 2 suitcases and a dream that my family thought was foolish. I had no idea that this decision would lead to the most challenging and rewarding 4 years of my life, or that it would ultimately take me to exactly where I had always imagined myself, standing on that podium, listening to that song, wearing the colors of my country. But as the plane lifted off from Boston Logan Airport, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the absolute certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The Houston heat hit me like a wall when I stepped off the plane at Bush Intercontinental Airport. It was December 2011, and while Boston was preparing for winter, Houston felt like a different planet entirely. I had never lived anywhere but New England, and everything about Texas seemed larger, louder, and more intense than what I was used to. My host family, the Rodriguezes, picked me up at the airport. Maria Rodriguez had been a collegiate gymnast at the University of Houston in the 1990s, and her husband Carlos worked as a physical therapist specializing in sports injuries. They had been hosting young gymnasts for over a decade, and their suburban home had become a way station for Olympic hopefuls from around the world. "You're quiet," Maria observed as we drove through the sprawling city toward their house. "Nervous?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. The reality of what I had done was beginning to sink in. I had left everything familiar, my family, my friends, my city, to chase a dream that most people never achieve. And I was about to find out whether I had what it took to compete at the highest levels of my sport. The Rodriguez house was a modest 2-story home in a neighborhood filled with similar houses, each with small front yards and driveways that housed minivans and pickup trucks. It was nothing like the historic elegance of Beacon Hill, but there was something warm and welcoming about it that my childhood home had never possessed. "Your roommate is already here," Maria said as she showed me to the small bedroom I would be sharing with another gymnast. "Her name is Samantha Torres. She's from Arizona, been training with Mike for about 2 years. Samantha was 17 like me, but she had been competing at the elite level since she was 14. She was small and compact, with the kind of muscular build that screamed serious athlete. When I introduced myself, she looked me up and down with the assessing gaze of someone who had seen plenty of hopefuls come and go. "So you're the one Mike's been talking about," she said, not unkindly but without particular warmth. "The late starter with natural talent." "I guess," I said, unsure whether that was a compliment or an observation. "We'll see," she said, returning to the homework spread across her bed. "Training starts at 6 tomorrow morning. Don't be late." That night, I lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of a Texas suburb, air conditioning units humming, cars passing on the street, the distant hum of highway traffic. I thought about my parents, probably having dinner at our dining room table, discussing their workdays, and maybe wondering where I was sleeping. I thought about Catherine, who had called me twice since I left Boston but whose calls I hadn't yet returned. I had never felt so alone in my life. The next morning, I got my first taste of what elite gymnastics training actually meant. Lone Star Gymnastics occupied a massive warehouse facility on the outskirts of Houston, with high ceilings, industrial lighting, and enough equipment to outfit a small college program. But what struck me immediately wasn't the equipment. It was the atmosphere. This wasn't like the rec center in Boston, where kids laughed and parents chatted on the sidelines. This was a place of business, where serious athletes came to push their bodies to the absolute limit. The gymnasts moved with purpose and precision, their faces focused and determined. There was no casual conversation, no wasted motion, no room for anything that didn't contribute to the goal of perfection. Mike Chen was waiting for me near the uneven bars, clipboard in hand, wearing the kind of serious expression that made it clear this was not going to be a gentle introduction to elite training. "Jessica," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had coached Olympic medalists. "Welcome to the real world." The first thing Mike did was evaluate my current skill level. He had me perform routines on each event: vault, uneven bars, balance beam, and floor exercise, while he and his assistant coaches took notes and videos. I had thought I was pretty good based on my experience at the rec center, but performing in front of Mike Chen felt like auditioning for a role I wasn't sure I was qualified for. "You have natural ability," Mike said after watching me complete a beam routine that I thought had gone reasonably well, "but your technique needs complete reconstruction. You've developed some bad habits that will limit your progress at the elite level." What followed was the most humbling experience of my athletic life. Mike broke down every aspect of my gymnastics, from the way I approached the vault to the angle of my arms during floor tumbling passes. Skills that I had performed confidently for years suddenly felt foreign and awkward as he corrected years of improper technique. "Elite gymnastics isn't about doing skills," he explained as he spotted me through a bar routine that felt completely different from anything I had done before. "It's about doing skills perfectly, consistently, under pressure. What you've been doing is recreational gymnastics. This is professional athletics." The training schedule was unlike anything I had experienced. We trained 6 days a week, 4 hours in the morning and 4 hours in the afternoon, with strength and conditioning sessions in between. My body, which had felt strong and capable at the rec center, was suddenly pushed beyond every limit I thought I had. The other gymnasts at Lone Star were a mix of ages and skill levels, but they all shared something I was still learning: the ability to push through pain, exhaustion, and frustration in pursuit of incremental improvement. These weren't kids playing a sport, they were athletes building careers. There was Elena Petrov, a 15-year-old from Russia, whose family had moved to Houston specifically for her training. She could perform skills on beam that I had only seen in Olympic competitions, and she did them with a casualness that suggested they were as natural as walking. There was Marcus Johnson, an 18-year-old who was training for the men's Olympic team. He had been homeschooled since he was 12 and had no life outside of gymnastics. His conversation revolved entirely around technique, competition strategy, and injury prevention. And there was Samantha, my roommate, who was attempting to make her second Olympic team after narrowly missing the 2012 London Games. She had been training at this level for so long that she could perform entire routines while mentally reviewing her grocery list. "You're thinking too much," she told me after watching me struggle through a bar routine during my second week. "Elite gymnastics is about muscle memory and instinct. You can't think your way through a layout double-double." But thinking was all I knew how to do. I had been raised in a family that solved problems through analysis and logic, and suddenly I was in a world where success depended on trusting my body to do things that defied rational thought. The physical demands were brutal, but the mental challenges were even worse. Every day brought new skills to learn, new techniques to master, new ways to push my body beyond what I thought was possible. I fell constantly, off the beam, off the bars, onto the floor during tumbling passes. My hands were raw from gripping the uneven bars, my shins were bruised from beam dismounts, and my entire body ached in ways I had never experienced. But it was the psychological pressure that really tested me. In elite gymnastics, there is no room for good enough. Every routine had to be perfect. Every skill had to be executed with precision. Every training session had to show measurable improvement. The margin for error was non-existent, and the standards were impossibly high. 3 weeks into training, I had my first major breakdown. I was working on a new vault, a Yurchenko double twist that required me to do a round-off onto the springboard, back handspring onto the vault table, and then launch into a double twisting layout. I had been working on it for days, and I couldn't seem to get the timing right. Again, Mike said after I landed short for the 15th time that day. I walked back to the end of the runway, my legs shaking from exhaustion, and my confidence completely shattered. As I prepared to run, I could feel the eyes of the other gymnasts on me, watching to see if the new girl had what it took to survive at this level. I ran as hard as I could, hit the springboard, and launched into the vault. But instead of rotating cleanly, I over-rotated and crashed onto my back, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I lay there on the mat, staring up at the warehouse ceiling, fighting back tears of frustration and exhaustion. "Get up," Mike said, not unkindly but without sympathy. "That's what elite training looks like. You fall, you get up, you try again." That night, I called my parents for the first time since arriving in Houston. My father answered, his voice careful and controlled. "Jessica," he said, "how are you adjusting?" I almost told him the truth, that I was struggling, that the training was harder than I had imagined, that I was questioning whether I had made the right decision. But something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the knowledge that admitting difficulty would validate every concern they had raised. "I'm good," I said. "The training is intense, but I'm learning a lot." "And you're happy?" my mother asked, having picked up the other extension. I looked around the Rodriguez house, at the simple furniture and family photos, at Samantha doing homework at the kitchen table while icing her ankles. I thought about the gym, about the daily grind of trying to perfect skills that most people couldn't even imagine attempting. "I'm where I need to be," I said. After I hung up, Samantha looked up from her textbook. "Rough day?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "It gets easier," she said. "Not the training. That stays hard. But you get stronger. You learn to trust your body and stop fighting against what it's trying to do." That night, I lay in bed reviewing the day's training session in my mind. I thought about the vault I had been struggling with, about the technical adjustments Mike had suggested, about the feeling of flying through the air before the crash landing. And for the first time since arriving in Houston, I felt something other than doubt and exhaustion. I felt determination. The next morning, I was the first one in the gym. 6 months into my training at Lone Star Gymnastics, Mike Chen made an announcement that changed everything. It was a humid Thursday morning in June 2012, and we were finishing our conditioning session when he gathered all the elite gymnasts together near the floor exercise area. "The American Classic is coming up in July," he said, referring to one of the most important competitions in the U.S. gymnastics calendar. "It's where we identify athletes who have the potential to compete at the senior elite level. Jessica, I'm entering you." My heart stopped. The American Classic wasn't just any competition. It was where Olympic dreams were made or broken. It was where gymnasts proved they belonged among the best in the country, where college scholarships were earned, and where national team scouts identified future champions. "Mike," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I don't think I'm ready." He looked at me with the same intensity he brought to every training session. Ready isn't about feeling confident. Ready is about having the skills and the mental toughness to compete. You have both. The other gymnasts nodded in agreement, but I could see something else in their eyes, a mixture of excitement and concern. They knew what I was just beginning to understand. This competition would determine whether I was serious Olympic material or just another talented athlete who couldn't handle the pressure. Samantha pulled me aside after practice. "The Classic is different from anything you've experienced," she said. "It's not about hitting your routines in training. It's about performing under pressure, in front of judges who can end your career with a single score." That night, I called my sister Catherine for the first time since moving to Houston. She was in her office in Boston, working late on a case, but she made time to talk. "How's the gymnastics going?" she asked, her voice carrying the polite interest of someone who still didn't quite understand what I was doing. "I'm competing in the American Classic next month," I said. There was a pause. "Is that good?" I laughed despite my nerves. "It's huge, Catherine. It's like if you were arguing a case in front of the Supreme Court as a first-year associate." "Oh," her voice shifted, becoming more focused. "Are you prepared?" It was a good question. After 6 months of training, I had developed new skills, improved my technique, and built the kind of physical strength that elite gymnastics demanded. But preparation for a competition like the American Classic wasn't just about physical readiness. It was about mental preparation for a level of pressure I had never experienced. Mike restructured my entire training schedule in preparation for the Classic. Instead of learning new skills, we focused on perfecting routines, building consistency, and developing the mental toughness that separated good gymnasts from great ones. Competition gymnastics is about hitting routines when it matters most, Mike explained during one of our preparation sessions. Anyone can perform well in training. Champions perform well when the lights are on and the judges are watching. The routines we developed for the Classic were conservative by elite standards, but they were routines I could hit consistently. My vault was a Yurchenko 1.5 twist, challenging but within my skill range. My bars routine featured a solid dismount and clean connections. My beam routine was steady and confident, without the risky elements that could lead to falls. And my floor routine showcased my natural artistry while including tumbling passes that played to my strengths. "You're not trying to win this competition," Mike reminded me constantly. "You're trying to prove that you belong at this level. Hit your routines, show your potential, and let the judges see what you can become." But as the competition approached, I began to understand something that no amount of training could fully prepare me for: the weight of representing not just myself, but everyone who had invested in my success. The Rodriguez family had supported me for months, providing housing and emotional support. Mike had restructured his coaching schedule to work with me individually. Even the other gymnasts at Lone Star had helped me prepare, offering advice and encouragement. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I thought about my parents. They had made it clear that they didn't support my decision, but I wondered if they would be watching the competition results online, curious to see how their daughter was doing in the world she had chosen over the one they had planned for her. The American Classic was held at the Caroli Ranch in Huntsville, Texas, about an hour outside of Houston. The facility was legendary in the gymnastics world. It was where the U.S. national team trained, where Olympic champions were made, and where the most important competitions in American gymnastics were held. When we arrived at the ranch, I was struck by how different it felt from the suburban training facility I had gotten used to. This was hallowed ground in the gymnastics world, and I could feel the weight of history in every building, every training apparatus, every carefully maintained piece of equipment. "Try not to be overwhelmed," Samantha advised as we walked through the main training facility. "It's just another gym with fancier equipment." But it wasn't just another gym. The walls were lined with photos of Olympic champions, world medalists, and national team members. The equipment was pristine, the lighting was perfect, and the atmosphere was charged with the kind of energy that only comes from serious competition. The other competitors were a mix of established elite gymnasts and newcomers like me. Some were returning Olympic team members. Others were former NCAA champions trying to make a comeback. And a few were teenagers who had been training at the elite level since they were 10 years old. I watched them warm up with a mixture of admiration and terror. These weren't recreational gymnasts or even collegiate athletes. These were professional gymnasts whose entire lives revolved around perfecting their sport. They moved with a confidence and precision that I was still developing, and their skill level was intimidating. "Don't watch the other gymnasts," Mike advised. "Focus on your own preparation. You're not competing against them. You're competing against your own potential." But it was impossible not to notice the caliber of athlete I was competing against. There was Jordan Mitchell, a 19-year-old from California who had been alternate on the 2012 Olympic team. Her floor routine included tumbling passes that defied gravity, and she performed them with the kind of casualness that suggested they were as natural as breathing. There was Ashley Chen, again no relation despite our shared last name, a 17-year-old from Michigan who had been competing at the elite level since she was 13. Her beam routine included skills that I had only seen in Olympic finals, and she performed them with rock-solid consistency. And there was Rebecca Torres, Samantha's younger sister, who had been training at a facility in Colorado. She was only 16, but she had already won multiple national championships and was considered a lock for the next Olympic team. The competition format was straightforward. Each gymnast would perform routines on all 4 events, and the scores would be combined to determine overall standings. But what made the American Classic particularly nerve-wracking was that it was also a qualification event for the national championships, which meant that poor performance here could end Olympic dreams before they really began. The night before competition, I lay in my bed at the ranch dormitory, listening to the sounds of other gymnasts preparing for the biggest day of their competitive season. Some were reviewing their routines mentally, others were talking quietly with their coaches, and a few were dealing with pre-competition nerves in their own ways. I thought about the phone call I had made to my parents earlier that day. My mother had answered, her voice carefully neutral. "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" she had asked. "Nervous," I admitted, "but ready." "We'll be thinking of you," she said, and for the first time in months I heard something in her voice that might have been pride. The competition day started at 6 a.m. with a light breakfast and a team meeting. Mike reviewed the competition schedule, reminded us of our routine strategy, and offered last-minute technical advice. But mostly he focused on the mental aspects of competition. "Remember," he said, looking at each of us individually, "you've done the work. You've prepared for this moment. Trust your training, trust your preparation, and trust yourself." As we walked into the main competition arena, I felt the full weight of what I was attempting. The venue was filled with coaches, judges, and scouts from colleges and national teams. The lighting was bright and professional, the equipment was perfectly positioned, and the atmosphere was electric with competitive energy. This was it. This was the moment when I would find out whether the dream I had been chasing for the past 6 months was realistic, or just the fantasy my parents had always believed it to be. I looked up at the scoreboard, where my name was listed among the competitors: Jessica Chen, Lone Star Gymnastics, Houston, Texas. For the first time since leaving Boston, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. The warm-up period was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes. I had 30 minutes to prepare mentally for the most important 4 routines of my life. 30 minutes to prove that I belonged among the best gymnasts in the country. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and began my pre-competition routine, the same mental preparation I had practiced hundreds of times in training. But this time, it wasn't practice. This time, it was real. The warm-up music began at exactly 8:30 a.m., and suddenly the Karoli Ranch transformed from a quiet training facility into an arena of intense competition. 24 elite gymnasts moved through their warm-up routines, with the kind of focused precision that only comes from years of high-level training. I started on vault, my strongest event, which Mike had strategically chosen to build my confidence early in the competition. The vault runway stretched out before me like a path to either triumph or disaster, and I could feel the eyes of judges, coaches, and competitors on me as I prepared for my first pass. "Remember," Mike said quietly as I chalked my hands, "you've done this vault thousands of times. Trust your muscle memory." But this wasn't training. The vault table seemed higher, the runway longer, and the landing area smaller than what I was used to. The arena lighting cast different shadows, and the sound of my footsteps echoed differently in the large space. Everything felt familiar yet foreign at the same time. I took my position at the end of the runway, raised my arms to signal the judges, and heard the electronic beep that meant I had 30 seconds to begin. The world narrowed to just me, the runway, and the vault table 75 feet away. I ran harder than I ever had in training, hit the springboard with perfect timing, and launched into my Yurchenko 1.5 twist. For a moment, I was flying through the air, rotating cleanly, and then my feet hit the mat with a solid thud. I stuck the landing. No steps, no stumbles, just clean execution. The score flashed on the board, 14.650. It wasn't the highest score of the warm-up, but it was respectable, and more importantly, it was a score that announced I belonged at this level. "Good start," Mike said, but I could see the relief in his eyes. We both knew that a fall or major mistake on my first event could have derailed my entire competition. Next was uneven bars, the event that had given me the most trouble during training. The bars required not just physical strength but perfect timing and spatial awareness. One small mistake in hand placement or release timing could result in a fall that would end my Olympic dreams. As I waited for my turn, I watched Jordan Mitchell perform a routine that looked effortless, despite including some of the most difficult skills in the sport. Her bar routine was a masterpiece of connection and flow, and she dismounted with a double layout that she landed like she was stepping off a curb. "Your turn," Mike said, and suddenly I was standing beneath the bars, applying chalk to my grips and trying to calm my racing heart. I jumped to the low bar, caught it cleanly, and began my routine. The first few skills felt solid. My kip was strong, my cast handstand was straight, and my transition to the high bar was smooth. But then I came to the most challenging part of my routine, a release skill called a Jaeger, where I had to release the bar, do a front flip, and recatch it. I swung back, built up momentum, and released the bar. For a terrifying moment, I was spinning through the air with nothing but space between me and the floor. Then my hands found the bar again, and I caught it cleanly. The relief was overwhelming, but I still had to finish the routine. My dismount was a double back tuck, a skill I had been working on for months. I swung around the bar one final time, released at the perfect moment, and rotated twice before landing. Again, I stuck it. Score: 14.200. Not spectacular, but solid enough to keep me in contention. Balance beam was third, and it was the event that separated elite gymnasts from everyone else. The beam was only 4 inches wide, but the skills performed on it were as complex as anything done on the floor. One wobble, one loss of focus, one moment of doubt could send you tumbling to the mat. I had watched Ashley Chen perform a beam routine that looked like it belonged in an Olympic final. Her series of back handsprings were perfectly straight, her leap series showed incredible flexibility, and her dismount, a double pike, was landed with textbook precision. When my turn came, I stood at the end of the beam, took a deep breath, and stepped up. The beam felt solid beneath my feet, but I knew that feeling could change in an instant. My routine began with a back walkover, followed by a series of dance elements that showcased my artistry. Everything felt good until I reached my leap series. As I prepared for a switch leap, I felt myself wobble slightly. It was barely noticeable to the audience, but to me, it felt like the beam was shifting beneath my feet. I had to make a split-second decision: play it safe and perform a simpler skill, or trust my training and go for the full difficulty. I went for it. The switch leap felt perfect, and I followed it immediately with a ring leap that stretched my back leg behind me, in a move that required both strength and flexibility. The connection was clean, and I could feel my confidence building. My dismount was a layout step-out, a skill that required me to flip backward off the beam and land on one foot before stepping down with the other. I had practiced this dismount hundreds of times, but never under this kind of pressure. I set up for the dismount, pushed off the beam, and rotated backward. I could see the mat rushing up to meet me, and I extended my right leg to absorb the landing. My foot hit the mat cleanly, and I stepped down with my left foot without any additional steps. Score: 14.475. My best score of the day so far. Floor exercise was my final event, and it was where I felt most confident. Floor was where my natural artistry could shine, where I could tell a story through movement and music while still showcasing the athletic skills that defined elite gymnastics. My music began, a dramatic piece that started quietly and built to a powerful crescendo. I had choreographed the routine with one of Mike's assistants, and it was designed to highlight my strengths while hiding my weaknesses. My first tumbling pass was a double layout, a skill that required me to flip backward twice while keeping my body straight. I had been working on this pass for months, and it felt solid from the moment I began the run. I landed it with just a small step forward. The routine continued with a series of dance elements that connected my tumbling passes. I had always loved this part of gymnastics, the ability to combine athletic power with artistic expression. For 90 seconds, I was both athlete and performer, telling a story through movement. My second tumbling pass was a double pike, where I flipped backward twice while keeping my body in a folded position. This was a more difficult skill than the double layout, and it required perfect timing and spatial awareness. I nailed it, landing with both feet planted firmly on the floor. The routine was building to its climax, and I could feel the energy in the arena. My final tumbling pass was a 1.5 twist punch front, a combination that showcased both power and precision. I approached it with more confidence than I had felt all day. I completed the pass cleanly, and as my music reached its final notes, I struck my ending pose with my arms raised triumphantly. For the first time since the competition began, I allowed myself to smile. Score: 14.725. my highest score of the day. As I waited for the final results, I realized that regardless of where I placed, I had accomplished something significant. I had competed at the elite level without falling, without major mistakes, and without embarrassing myself or my coach. I had proven that I belonged among the best gymnasts in the country. The final standings were announced in reverse order. I wasn't expecting to place high. Most of the competitors had been training at this level for years, and I had been elite for less than a year. But when they called out the top 10 finishers, I heard something that made my heart skip. In 7th place, with a total score of 57.050, Jessica Chen from Lone Star Gymnastics. 7th place. Out of 24 of the best gymnasts in the country, I had finished 7th. More importantly, I had achieved the score necessary to qualify for the national championships, which meant my Olympic dreams were still alive. Mike hugged me with an emotion I had never seen from him before. "You did it," he said. "You proved you belong here." But the real validation came from my competitors. Jordan Mitchell, who had won the competition, came over to congratulate me. "Great job," she said. "You competed like a veteran today." Ashley Chen, who had finished 2nd, nodded in agreement. "You've got natural talent and great composure. Keep working, and you'll be dangerous." That night I called my parents from my room at the ranch. My father answered, and I could hear the television in the background. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice carrying a nervousness I hadn't heard before. "I finished 7th, I said. "I qualified for nationals." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then my mother's voice, speaking from the extension. "7th? Out of how many?" 24, I said. "The best gymnasts in the country." Another pause. Then my father's voice, quieter now. "We're proud of you, Jessica." It was the first time in almost a year that my parents had expressed pride in my gymnastics career. I had proven something to them, but more importantly, I had proven something to myself. I belonged at this level. I could compete with the best. And for the first time since leaving Boston, I truly believed that my Olympic dreams were possible. The American Classic was over, but my journey was just beginning. National championships were 3 months away, and that competition would determine whether I made the national team. Making the national team would put me in position to compete for a spot on the Olympic team. The path ahead was still long and uncertain, but that night, lying in my bed at the Caroli Ranch, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: confidence in my choice and excitement about my future. I was no longer just a girl with a dream. I was a legitimate contender. 3 months after the American Classic, I stood in the athlete lounge at the P&G Championships in Hartford, Connecticut, watching the best gymnasts in America prepare for the most important competition of the year. The national championships weren't just about winning titles. They were about making the national team, which was the gateway to international competition, and, ultimately, the Olympics. The months between the Classic and Nationals had been transformative. Mike had restructured my training entirely, focusing on upgrading my difficulty level and building the consistency that separated national team members from everyone else. The gym had become my second home, and sometimes I spent more time there than at the Rodriguez house. "Your beam routine needs a new dismount," Mike had announced in August, 2 months before Nationals. "The layout step-out is safe, but it's not going to get you the scores you need to make the team." He was right. The national team was selected based on a combination of difficulty, execution, and consistency. My current routines were solid, but they weren't spectacular. If I wanted to compete against the best in the world, I needed to upgrade my skills to match theirs. The new dismount was a double pike, the same skill I had been performing on floor, but now I had to execute it off a 4-inch beam while maintaining perfect form and sticking the landing. The first time I attempted it, I barely rotated once before crashing onto the mat. "It's a mental block," Samantha observed after watching me struggle with the skill for weeks. "You know you can do a double pike on floor. The beam is just a different launching point." But knowing something intellectually and trusting your body to do it are completely different things. Every time I set up for the dismount, my brain reminded me that I was flipping backward off a narrow beam, with nothing but a thin mat to catch me if I miscalculated. Elena Petrov, who had become something of a mentor to me, offered a different perspective. "In Russia, we have saying," she said in her accented English. "Fear is just excitement without breath. You must breathe through the fear." She was right. The breakthrough came during a late-night training session in September. I was working alone with Mike, practicing the dismount for the 100th time that week. Instead of thinking about the technical aspects of this skill, I focused on breathing, on trusting my body, on remembering the feeling of flying through the air. I set up for the dismount, took a deep breath, and launched myself backward off the beam. This time, I rotated cleanly, opened up at the perfect moment, and landed with both feet planted firmly on the mat. No steps, no stumbles, just clean execution. "That's it," Mike said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. "That's the skill that's going to get you noticed." But upgrading my beam routine was just one part of the preparation. Mike also added new elements to my bars routine, including a different release skill called a pack salto, where I had to release the high bar, do a front flip, and catch the low bar. It was a risky skill that could result in a spectacular fall if mistimed, but it was also worth significant bonus points. My floor routine received a complete overhaul. The double layout that had been my most difficult pass was replaced with a double-double 2 flips with 2 twists, a skill that only the most elite gymnasts in the world could perform consistently. The first time I landed it cleanly in training, the entire gym stopped to watch. "You're not the same gymnast who walked in here a year ago," Mike told me during one of our training sessions. "You've developed the skills and the mental toughness to compete at the international level." The changes weren't just physical. My relationship with my parents had evolved significantly since the American Classic. They still didn't fully understand my world, but they had begun to take my career seriously. My father had started following gymnastics scores online, and my mother had learned enough about the sport to ask informed questions about my training. Catherine had become my biggest supporter within the family. She had flown to Houston to watch me train, and she had been amazed by the level of athleticism and dedication required for elite gymnastics. "I had no idea," she said after watching a typical training session. "This isn't a sport, it's a lifestyle. You're basically a professional athlete." The recognition felt good, but it also added pressure. Now that my family was paying attention, I felt the weight of their expectations along with my own. I wasn't just representing myself anymore. I was representing everyone who had supported me along the way. The week before Nationals, I received an unexpected visitor at the gym. My parents had flown to Houston to watch me train, their first visit since I had moved to Texas. They sat in the stands of the Lone Star facility, watching me work through my routines with the same focused attention they brought to their professional responsibilities. "Your vault has improved significantly," my father observed during a break in training. It was the first time he had offered technical commentary on my gymnastics, and it meant more to me than any score from a judge. My mother was more emotional. "I'm sorry we didn't understand," she said quietly. "We thought you were running away from responsibility. But you were running towards something much more demanding than anything we could have imagined." The apology felt like a weight lifting from my shoulders. I had been carrying the burden of their disapproval for over a year, and their recognition of my dedication meant everything. "I know you were trying to protect me," I said, "but I needed to find my own path." "You found more than a path," my father said. "You found your calling." The national championships were held at the XL Center in Hartford, a professional hockey arena that had been transformed into a gymnastics venue. The atmosphere was electric, with thousands of spectators, dozens of college coaches, and representatives from USA Gymnastics, all watching to see who would earn the right to represent America in international competition. The competition format was different from the American Classic. Instead of one day of competition, Nationals was a 2-day event. The first day determined the all-around champion and the top gymnasts in each event. The second day featured event finals, where the top 8 gymnasts on each apparatus competed for individual titles. But what mattered most was the selection process for the national team. The top gymnasts from Nationals would be invited to the national team training camp, where they would compete for spots on international teams leading up to the Olympics. I had been training for this moment for over a year, but standing in the warm-up gym at the XL Center, I felt the same nervousness I had experienced at the American Classic. The difference was that now I knew I belonged here. I had proven myself capable of competing at this level, and I had upgraded my routines to match the difficulty of the other contenders. The warm-up period was intense. Every gymnast was working through their most difficult skills, and the level of talent was overwhelming. There was Simone Biles, who was already being hailed as the greatest gymnast of all time. There was Caitlin Ohashi, whose floor routine was a masterpiece of artistry and athleticism. There was Madison Koshian, whose bars routine was so difficult that other gymnasts stopped to watch her practice. "Don't get intimidated," Mike reminded me as we walked through my competition strategy. "You've earned the right to be here. Trust your training and compete your own meet." The competition began with a parade of athletes, where each gymnast was introduced to the crowd. When they announced my name, Jessica Chen, representing Lone Star Gymnastics, I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with scores or rankings. I was representing not just myself, but everyone who had supported me along the way. My first event was vault, and I was scheduled to compete my upgraded skill, a Yurchenko double twist, significantly more difficult than the 1.5 I had performed at the Classic. The skill required perfect timing and spatial awareness, and there was no room for error at this level. I took my position at the end of the runway, raised my arms to signal the judges, and heard the familiar beep. The world narrowed to just me and the vault table, and I ran with everything I had. The vault felt perfect from the moment I hit the springboard. I rotated twice cleanly, opened up at the perfect moment, and landed with just a small step forward. The crowd responded with applause, and I could see Mike pumping his fist in celebration. Score: 15.100. It was the highest vault score of my career, and it put me in second place after the first rotation. The rest of the competition was a blur of adrenaline and focus. My bars routine was clean, with the new pack salto executed perfectly. My beam routine included the upgraded double pike dismount, which I stuck cold, and my floor routine showcased the double-double that had taken months to perfect. When the final scores were tallied, I had finished 4th in the all-around competition. 4th place at the U.S. National Championships. A year and a half after leaving Boston to chase an impossible dream, I was one of the top 4 gymnasts in the country. But the real prize wasn't the placement. It was the invitation that came with it. That night, I received a call from the national team coordinator. "Jessica," she said, "congratulations on your performance today. We'd like to invite you to the national team training camp next month. You're being considered for international assignments." International assignments. The words felt surreal. I was being considered to represent the United States in international competition, to wear the red, white, and blue uniform I had dreamed about since I was 8 years old. That night I called my parents from my hotel room in Hartford. They answered together, their voices excited and proud. "4th place," my mother said, "at the national championships. Do you understand what that means?" "It means I'm going to represent our country," I said, and for the first time in my life I heard both of my parents crying tears of joy. The girl who had been called an embarrassment to her family was now being considered to represent her country on the world stage. The impossible dream was becoming reality. The national team training camp was held at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, a facility that had been home to America's Olympic dreams for decades. As our plane descended through the Rocky Mountains, I pressed my face against the window, watching the sprawling complex come into view. Somewhere in those buildings, Olympic champions had been forged, and I was about to find out if I had what it took to join their ranks. The facility was unlike anything I had experienced. While the Karolyi Ranch had been focused and intense, the Olympic Training Center felt sacred. The walls were lined with photos of American Olympic medalists from every sport imaginable, and the dining hall featured a massive display of Olympic rings that seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights. "Welcome to the big leagues," said Martha Karolyi, the national team coordinator, as she addressed our group of 12 gymnasts who had been invited to camp. "You're here because you've proven you can compete at the highest level domestically. Now we need to see if you can represent the United States internationally." The camp was structured like a combination of training intensive and audition. For 5 days, we would train alongside current national team members, work with the national team coaches, and compete in mock competitions that simulated the pressure of international events. At the end of the camp, assignments would be made for upcoming international competitions. My roommate was Reagan Smith, a gymnast from Texas who had been on the national team for 2 years. She was only 19, but she had already competed at World Championships and was considered a lock for the Olympic team. "The training here is different from what you're used to," she warned me as we unpacked our bags. "Martha doesn't just want to see your skills. She wants to see how you handle pressure, how you work with teammates, and how you represent the country." The first day of training was a shock to my system. While I had been training at an elite level for over a year, the national team environment was several levels beyond that. Every movement was analyzed, every routine was videotaped, and every interaction was evaluated for team chemistry and leadership potential. The gymnasts at camp weren't just competitors, they were potential teammates. We worked together on combination routines, spotted each other through difficult skills, and provided encouragement during challenging training sessions. It was a different dynamic from the individual focus I had been used to. But what struck me most was the level of patriotism that permeated everything. When we walked into the gym each morning, we passed a wall of American flags from every Olympics since 1896. Before each training session, we stood for a moment of silence to honor the athletes who had represented our country before us. "You're not just competing for yourself anymore," Martha explained during one of our team meetings. "You're competing for 320 million Americans who believe in what you're doing. That's a privilege and a responsibility." The pressure was immense, but it was also inspiring. For the first time in my gymnastics career, I felt connected to something larger than personal achievement. I was part of a tradition that stretched back over a century, a legacy of American athletes who had used their talents to represent their country on the world's biggest stage. The mock competition on the third day was designed to simulate international pressure. We competed in front of a panel of judges, coaches, and USA gymnastics officials, all of whom were evaluating our readiness for international assignments. The format was identical to what we would face at World Championships or the Olympics. I drew vault as my first event, and I was scheduled to compete my most difficult skill, the Yurchenko double twist that had become my signature. As I prepared at the end of the runway, I could feel the weight of evaluation from the panel of observers. But something was different this time. Instead of feeling nervous, I felt excited. The pressure that had once intimidated me now felt like fuel. I was representing not just myself but the dream of every American gymnast who had ever wanted to wear the red, white, and blue. I ran down the runway with more power than I had ever generated, hit the springboard perfectly, and launched into the vault. The rotation felt clean, the landing was solid, and when I raised my arms in salute, I heard applause from the other gymnasts. Score: 15.250. It was the highest vault score recorded at the camp. The rest of my routines were equally strong. My bars routine was hit with confidence and precision. My beam routine included the double pike dismount that had become my trademark. And my floor routine showcased the artistry and power that had always been my strengths. When the final scores were announced, I had finished second in the all-around, behind only Simone Biles. But more importantly, I had demonstrated the consistency and mental toughness that international competition required. That evening, Martha called me into her office. The walls were covered with team photos from every Olympics since she had become national team coordinator, and I could see the pride in her eyes as she looked at the legacy she had helped create. "Jessica," she said, "you've exceeded every expectation we had when we invited you to camp. Your progress over the past year has been remarkable." I waited, knowing that the real news was coming. "I'm assigning you to the team for the World Championships in Glasgow next month. You'll be competing all around and contributing to the team total." World Championships. The words hit me like a physical force. I was going to represent the United States at the World Championships, the second most prestigious competition in gymnastics after the Olympics. "I won't let you down," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know you won't," Martha replied, "but remember, you're not just representing yourself. You're representing every American who believes in the power of dreams and hard work." The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation. I returned to Houston to continue training with Mike, but now everything had changed. I wasn't just an elite gymnast anymore. I was a member of the United States national team. The uniform fitting was an experience I will never forget. When I put on the red, white, and blue warm-up suit for the first time, I felt a surge of emotion that caught me completely off guard. This was the uniform I had dreamed about wearing since I was 8 years old, watching the Olympics on television in my parents' living room. How does it feel? Mike asked, and I could see the pride in his eyes as he looked at his athlete wearing the national team colors. It feels like home, I said, and I meant it. The preparation for World Championships was different from anything I had experienced. In addition to training my routines, I had to work with media specialists who taught me how to handle interviews, nutritionists who optimized my diet for international competition, and sports psychologists who helped me develop mental strategies for competing under extreme pressure. But the most meaningful preparation came from my teammates. The 5 other gymnasts who had been selected for the World Championships team took me under their wing, sharing their experiences and helping me understand what it meant to compete for the United States. The first time you hear the national anthem played for you, it will change your life, Simone told me during one of our training sessions. Everything you've worked for, everything you've sacrificed, it all makes sense in that moment. I thought about that conversation often in the weeks leading up to Glasgow. I had been chasing this moment for almost 2 years, but I still couldn't quite imagine what it would feel like to stand on an international podium, listening to the Star-Spangled Banner, knowing that I had earned the right to be there. My parents flew to Houston the week before we left for Scotland. It was their second visit to the gym, but this time they came as supporters rather than skeptics. They watched me train with the same focused attention they had always brought to their professional responsibilities, but now their attention was filled with pride rather than concern. "We owe you an apology," my mother said during dinner at the Rodriguez house. "We thought we were protecting you from disappointment, but we were actually standing in the way of your destiny." "You were being parents," I replied. "You wanted me to be safe and successful. I understand that now." My father, who had always been a man of few words, spoke up. "When I watch you compete, I see something I never saw in my surgical career. You're not just performing skills, you're creating art. You're inspiring people to believe in the impossible." The conversation continued late into the night, with my parents asking detailed questions about my training, my goals, and my experience representing the United States. For the first time in my life, they understood not just what I was doing, but why I was doing it. 2 days before we left for Glasgow, I received a package from my sister Catherine. Inside was a small American flag pin, along with a note that read, "For the girl who taught our family that dreams are worth chasing, make us proud." I pinned the flag to my training bag, where it would stay throughout the World Championships. It was a reminder of how far I had come, not just as a gymnast, but as a person who had learned to trust her own instincts and pursue her own path. The flight to Glasgow was my first international trip as a member of the national team. As we boarded the plane, I looked at my teammates, women who had become my sisters, my coaches who had become my mentors, and the support staff who had become my extended family. "Are you ready?" Reagan asked as we settled into our seats. I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The difficult conversation with my parents in Boston, the leap of faith that had taken me to Houston, the brutal training sessions that had pushed me beyond every limit, the competitions that had tested my mental toughness and physical abilities. "I'm ready," I said, and I meant it. In less than a week, I would be competing in front of the entire world, representing the United States at the World Championships. The girl who had been called an embarrassment to her family was about to compete for her country on the sport's biggest stage. The dream was no longer impossible. It was about to become reality. The Emirates Arena in Glasgow was a cathedral of gymnastics. As our team bus pulled up to the venue, I could see flags from over 40 countries flying in the Scottish breeze, and the massive banners advertising the World Championships made everything feel surreal. 2.5 years after that argument in my parents' Boston dining room, I was about to compete against the best gymnasts in the world. The athlete entrance was unlike anything I had experienced. Hundreds of photographers lined the walkway, their cameras clicking rapidly as each national team entered the arena. When it was our turn, I walked alongside my teammates wearing the official USA tracksuit, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "Remember," Martha whispered as we made our way through the media gauntlet, "you've earned the right to be here. Compete like you belong." The training sessions leading up to competition were intense. The arena was massive, with seating for 14,000 spectators and a competition floor that seemed to stretch forever. The equipment was pristine, The lighting was perfect, and the atmosphere was electric, with anticipation from gymnasts representing every continent. What struck me most was the caliber of athletes I was competing against. These weren't just national champions, they were Olympic medalists, world record holders, and legends of the sport. I watched Russia's Svetlana Korkina warming up her bars routine with skills I had only seen in videos. I saw Romania's Catalina Ponor practicing beam combinations that looked impossible to execute consistently. "Don't get starstruck," Simone advised during one of our training sessions. "They're incredible athletes, but they're also human. They make mistakes, they feel pressure, and they have bad days just like everyone else." She was right, but it was hard not to be intimidated by the level of talent surrounding me. These gymnasts had been competing internationally for years, and many of them had Olympic medals hanging in their homes. I was the newcomer, the unknown quantity, the athlete who had gone from recreational gymnastics to world championships in less than 3 years. The team meeting the night before competition was held in a conference room at our hotel. Martha stood at the front of the room, looking at the 6 gymnasts who would represent the United States the following day. The weight of expectation was palpable. "Tomorrow you'll compete in front of the entire world," she said. "Millions of people will be watching, hoping to see greatness. You have the skills, you have the preparation, and you have the heart to deliver that greatness." She went through the competition order and strategy. I was scheduled to compete in the all-around, which meant I would perform routines on all 4 events. The team gold medal would be determined by combining the scores of our top 3 performers on each event. "Jessica," Martha said, looking directly at me, "you're our anchor on floor exercise. That means you'll be the last American to compete on that event. The team result may come down to your routine." The responsibility was overwhelming. I had gone from being the girl who embarrassed her family to being the gymnast who might determine whether the United States won a world championship. The transformation felt impossible, but the evidence was sitting right in front of me. That night I called my parents from my hotel room. They were planning to wake up at 4 a.m. Boston time to watch the live broadcast, and I could hear the excitement in their voices. "How do you feel?" my mother asked. "Ready," I said, and I realized I meant it. "I've been preparing for this moment my entire life." "We'll be watching," my father said, "and we'll be proud regardless of what happens." The words meant everything to me. 2.5 years ago, my parents had been embarrassed by my athletic ambitions. Now they were staying up through the night to watch me compete for my country. Competition day began at 6 a.m. with breakfast and a team meeting. The arena was already buzzing with activity as we arrived for our final training session. The stands were filling with spectators, and I could see television cameras being positioned around the competition floor. The warm-up period was controlled chaos. 48 gymnasts from around the world were sharing 4 pieces of equipment, each trying to prepare for the most important competition of their lives. The energy was intense, focused, and slightly desperate. I started my warm-up on vault, my most confident event. The runway felt familiar beneath my feet, and my Yurchenko double twist was rotating cleanly. Mike stood at the end of the runway, offering technical cues and encouragement. "You've done this vault thousands of times," he reminded me. "Trust your muscle memory." But this wasn't practice. The arena was filling with spectators. The television cameras were rolling, and I could feel the weight of representing my country with every breath. The competition began with opening ceremonies that celebrated the host country and the international gymnastics community. As I marched with my teammates during the Parade of Nations, I felt connected to something larger than myself. I was part of a tradition that stretched back over a century, representing the dreams and aspirations of every American gymnast who had ever worn the red, white, and blue. When the competition began, I was scheduled to start on uneven bars. The event order in international competition is different from domestic meets, and bars was always my most technically challenging event. Starting there meant I would have to perform my most difficult routine while still settling into the competition rhythm. As I waited for my turn, I watched the other gymnasts compete. The level of execution was extraordinary. Skills that I had seen performed with minor form breaks in domestic competition were being executed with textbook precision. These athletes had been competing at this level for years, and their consistency was intimidating. "Jessica Chen, United States of America, you have 30 seconds." Hearing my name announced in the arena, with United States of America attached to it, was a moment I will never forget. I raised my arms to acknowledge the judges, took my position beneath the bars, and felt the weight of representing 320 million Americans. The routine began with my mount, a glide kip to handstand, that set the tone for everything that followed. My hands felt secure on the bars, my timing was perfect, and I moved through the first part of my routine with confidence I had never felt in competition. Then came the pak salto, the release skill that had taken months to master. I swung around the high bar, building momentum, and released at the perfect moment. For a terrifying instant, I was rotating through the air with nothing but space between me and the floor. Then my hands found the low bar, and I caught the skill cleanly. The rest of the routine flowed smoothly. My dismount was a double layout that I had practiced thousands of times, and I landed it with just a small step forward. As I saluted the judges, I felt a surge of confidence that carried me through the rest of the competition. Score: 14.800. It was the highest bars score of my career, and it put me in second place after the first event. Beam was next, and it was where I felt most comfortable. The 4-inch surface that had once seemed impossibly narrow now felt like home. My routine included the double pike dismount that had become my signature, and I executed it with the confidence of someone who belonged at this level. Score: 14.900. I was now in first place in the all-around competition. Floor exercise was my final event, and it was where I had always felt most expressive. As I prepared for my routine, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The difficult conversations with my parents, the leap of faith that had taken me to Houston, the brutal training sessions that had pushed me beyond every limit. My music began, and for 90 seconds, I was no longer Jessica Chen the gymnast. I was Jessica Chen the artist, telling a story through movement and athleticism. My tumbling passes were clean, my dance elements were expressive, and my final pose was held with the confidence of someone who had earned the right to be there. As I finished my routine, the arena erupted in applause. I had hit all 4 events without a major mistake, and I had performed with the consistency that international competition required. But the real validation came from my teammates. Simone was the first to congratulate me, followed by the rest of the team. "That was world-class," she said. "You competed like a veteran." The final all-around standings were announced an hour later. I had finished third, earning my first World Championships medal. But more importantly, the United States had won the team gold medal, and my floor routine had contributed the crucial score that secured the victory. As I stood on the podium with my teammates, listening to the Star-Spangled Banner play in the arena, I thought about everyone who had supported me along the way. The Rodriguez family who had given me a home, Mike who had believed in my potential, my teammates who had become my sisters. And I thought about my parents, who were probably crying tears of joy in their Boston living room as they watched their daughter represent their country on the world's biggest stage. The girl who had been called an embarrassment to her family was now a world champion. The impossible dream had become reality, and I was just getting started. The flight home from Glasgow was surreal. I sat in the airplane seat, staring at the bronze medal in my hands, my first individual World Championships medal, while my teammates slept around me. The team gold medal was safely packed in my carry-on bag, but I couldn't stop looking at the individual hardware that represented everything I had worked for. 26 hours earlier, I had been standing on the podium in the Emirates Arena, listening to the Star-Spangled Banner echo through the venue as the American flag rose to the rafters. Now I was returning to the United States as a world champion, but I still felt like the same person who had left Boston 3 years ago with nothing but a dream and a suitcase. The welcome reception at the airport was overwhelming. Hundreds of gymnastics fans had gathered to celebrate the team's success, and when I walked through the terminal wearing my gold medal, children held up signs with my name and asked for autographs. It was my first taste of what it meant to be a role model, and the responsibility felt both thrilling and terrifying. "How does it feel to be a world champion?" a reporter asked during the impromptu press conference in the airport. I thought about the question for a moment, remembering the girl who had been called an embarrassment to her family just 3 years earlier. "It feels like proof that impossible dreams are just dreams that haven't happened yet," I said. The quote would be replayed on sports broadcasts for weeks, but in that moment it was simply the truth about my journey. The drive back to Houston gave me time to process what had happened. Mike picked me up at the airport, and we drove through the Texas countryside in comfortable silence, both of us still adjusting to the reality of what we had accomplished together. "You know what this means, don't you?" he finally said as we pulled into the Lone Star Gymnastics parking lot. "What?" "You're not just a gymnast anymore, you're an inspiration. Kids all over the country watched you compete in Glasgow, and they're gonna start gymnastics because of what you did." He was right. Over the following weeks, I received hundreds of letters from young gymnasts who had watched the World Championships and decided to pursue their own Olympic dreams. Many of them shared stories similar to mine. Families who didn't understand their athletic ambitions, financial struggles, and the challenge of balancing dreams with practical concerns. But the most meaningful correspondence came from my own family. My parents had flown to Houston to celebrate my return, and for the first time in my life, they seemed genuinely excited about my athletic career. "We watched every routine," my mother said over dinner at the Rodriguez house, "and we finally understood what you've been working toward." My father, who had always been reserved with his emotions, was more expressive than I had ever seen him. "When they played the national anthem and you were standing on that podium, I felt a pride I'd never experienced before," he said. "Not just because you were successful, but because you had the courage to pursue something you believed in." The conversation continued late into the night, with my parents asking detailed questions about my training, my goals, and my plans for the future. For the first time since I was a child, I felt like they truly understood who I was and what I was trying to accomplish. But the real validation came from my sister Catherine, who had driven down from Dallas to join the celebration. She pulled me aside after dinner and said something that meant more than any medal or score. "Do you remember when we were kids, and you used to do cartwheels in the backyard for hours?" she asked. I nodded, remembering those childhood afternoons when gymnastics had been pure joy rather than serious competition. "Mom and Dad used to worry that you were wasting time, but I always knew you were different. You had this light in your eyes when you moved, like you were meant to do something special with your body." She paused, looking at the medals displayed on the Rodriguez family's dining room table. "I'm proud of you for following that light, even when nobody else could see it." The weeks following the World Championships were a whirlwind of appearances, interviews, and preparation for the next phase of my career. The 2016 Olympics in Rio de Janeiro were less than a year away, and making the Olympic team had become my new impossible dream. The training for Olympic preparation was different from anything I had experienced. Every skill had to be perfect, every routine had to be consistent, and every training session had to show measurable improvement. The margin for error was non-existent, and the pressure was unlike anything I had faced at the World Championships. But I had learned something important about myself during my journey. Pressure was just another form of energy, and I had become skilled at channeling that energy into performance. The girl who had once been intimidated by her parents' expectations was now thriving under the weight of an entire nation's Olympic hopes. The Olympic trials were held in San Jose, California in July 2016. 5 gymnasts would be selected to represent the United States at the Rio Olympics, and I was competing for one of those spots against the best gymnasts in the country. My parents flew to California to watch the trials, their first time attending one of my competitions in person. As I warmed up on the arena floor, I could see them in the stands, wearing USA shirts and cheering louder than anyone around them. The competition was the most intense of my career. Every routine mattered, every landing was crucial, and every score could determine Olympic dreams. I competed with the confidence of someone who had proven herself on the world stage, but I also felt the weight of representing everyone who had supported me along the way. When the final scores were announced, I had earned my spot on the Olympic team. The 5 gymnasts who would represent the United States in Rio were announced in front of a crowd of thousands and a television audience of millions. "Jessica Chen, from Lone Star Gymnastics in Houston, Texas," the announcer said, and I felt the same surge of emotion I had experienced at the World Championships. But this time, something was different. This time, I wasn't just representing myself, or even my country. I was representing every person who had ever been told their dreams were impossible, every athlete who had chosen a difficult path over a safe one, and every young person who needed proof that persistence could overcome any obstacle. The Olympics in Rio were everything I had imagined and more. The Olympic Village was a city of dreams, where athletes from every sport and every nation gathered to compete at the highest level. The gymnastics venue was packed with spectators from around the world, and the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. I competed in the team final, the all-around final, and the floor exercise final. The United States won the team gold medal, and I contributed crucial scores on beam and floor. In the all-around final, I finished fourth, just missing an individual medal but performing with the consistency that had become my trademark. But the floor exercise final was where everything came together. It was my last event of the Olympics, and I was competing against the best floor workers in the world. My routine included every skill I had developed over the past 4 years, and I performed it with the artistry and precision that had always been my strengths. When I landed my final tumbling pass and struck my ending pose, I knew I had delivered the performance of my life. The crowd erupted in applause, and I could see my parents in the stands, tears streaming down their faces. The score was announced, 15.200. It was enough for the silver medal, my first individual Olympic medal. As I stood on the podium, listening to the Star-Spangled Banner play in the Olympic arena, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The difficult conversation with my parents in Boston, the leap of faith that had taken me to Houston, the brutal training sessions that had pushed me beyond every limit, the competitions that had tested my mental toughness and physical abilities. But mostly, I thought about the girl who had been called an embarrassment to her family and who had chosen to pursue her dreams anyway. That girl had become an Olympic medalist, but more importantly, she had become someone who understood that the only approval that mattered was her own. After the Olympics, I returned to Boston for the first time in over 4 years. The city looked the same, but I was completely different. I was no longer the uncertain teenager who had left in search of a dream. I was an Olympic medalist, a world champion, and someone who had proven that impossible dreams were just dreams that required extraordinary effort. My parents hosted a reception at our family home in Beacon Hill, inviting friends, neighbors, and colleagues to celebrate my Olympic success. The same dining room where I had been called an embarrassment was now filled with people congratulating me on my achievements. But the most meaningful moment came when my mother stood up to make a toast. 3 years ago, our daughter made a decision that we didn't understand, she said, her voice carrying the emotion of someone who had learned an important lesson. She chose to leave the path we had planned for her and pursue something that seemed impossible. She paused, looking at me with eyes that held both pride and regret. We thought we were protecting her from disappointment, but we were actually standing in the way of her destiny. Jessica taught our family that the greatest risk isn't failing at something you love. It's succeeding at something you don't. The room fell silent as she raised her glass. To Jessica, who had the courage to chase her dreams when nobody else believed in them, you didn't just win medals. You won the right to live your life on your own terms. As I stood in that dining room, surrounded by the people who had once questioned my choices, I realized that the journey had been about more than gymnastics. It had been about finding the courage to trust my own instincts, to pursue my own path, and to prove that the only person who could define my worth was me. The girl who had been called an embarrassment to her family had become someone her family was proud to call their daughter. The impossible dream had become reality, and I had learned that the most important victory wasn't winning medals, it was winning the right to be myself. As the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, I found myself alone in the backyard, where I had done cartwheels as a child. I performed one more cartwheel, just for the joy of it, and listened to the sound of my own laughter echoing through the Boston night. The dreams were no longer impossible, they were just the beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.